Okay, so yesterday we talked quite a lot about, I've got a few key words here: truth, representation, fractions, fragments, fractals, the negative, negation, and I'm really going to be talking about similar themes, but through the lens, if you like, of a particular news construct. I'm interested in my own work, and my own work is informed by news as construction. And at the moment I've been particularly looking and reading about a lot of images that are in the news that sort of relate to events and constructed events as I see. My paper is really a lot of it is about what it's not about. So actually it's not about this image, but we might come back to that image. It is about these two images and some other images like it. And I'm looking at Alan Badu, and my sort of relationship, me and Alan Badu and I are in a sort of early stage of relationship. And so I really want to see how some of his themes might kind of lend themselves to some of the hang-ups that I've got, or some of the things that bother me about representation in news photographs. So I'm looking at this idea of the passion for the real. Both of these images here have some common themes. Both of them I'm thinking of in terms of fractions and fragments. They both relate to stories of sexual violence and bloody murder. So I'm afraid at 10:30 this morning we're going to be talking about some horrible stories. We won't necessarily be seeing many horrible images. And I want to explore today how they connect with a sense of the passion for the real. I've been reading a few writers, such as Zizek, and somebody at the moment called Buch, who's writing something called The Pathos of the Real. And my understanding of the passion for the real and the way it's kind of interpreted is this idea of spectacle in all its violence, in all its horror, that kind of breaks into our consciousness, if you like. It breaks into our sense of reality and delivers us the real. And we're motivated by this urge, this need, this passion. But my understanding with the 21st century image is that we've moved on from that, because I'm not sure that we believe in the real, and I'm not sure that we believe in reality as viewers. And so I'm wondering whether our passion for the real is motivated by all those things that images are not today. Are we seeing any truth in images that we see? But I'll sort of take you through the journey of my thinking. How many people in this room a lot of the images I'm going to be showing are very recognisable, but not necessarily to everybody. How many people in this room recognise the story behind this image and know this image? A few. But some people, you don't really need to know about it, but I'll remind you anyway. This is Chris Huhne, and Chris Huhne is a former senior cabinet minister in the UK coalition government. He asked his wife to take a speeding ticket for him to sort of save his reputation. And then he was caught. The story of him getting his wife to take this speeding ticket was leaked to a British newspaper. He denied it, then he confessed, and he spent a couple of months in prison. So this photograph, in many ways, is a representation of his fall from power, his humiliation. But in terms of talking about Chris Huhne, we're not really interested in him in this conference. We're interested in the construct of the photograph. Now, I've thought about this construct, and what I'm really focusing on is this thing where the accused, defendants, walk into court or walk out of court again. And in American jargon, it seems that it's known as the perp walk. The perpetrator walks into court, which is a really inflammatory and aggressive language, because obviously the accused here are damned before they've even reached the dock. And also the fact that it's the perp walk, the fact that it's actually sort of described in the dictionary as an arranged public appearance of the recently arrested for the benefit of the press, suggests that actually we all know that it's a construct. It's not about photojournalism responding to events as they happen, or have it, sort of taking a fraction or a moment in time. It's something that we know has been staged. It's not something, we're not looking at reality in any way. And I think that the viewer understands that. Okay, so this is somebody else. This isn't Chris Huhne. This is someone else who has been shamed and accused, somebody who is walking into court, and judging by the coat on his head, he doesn't want to be seen. But we are going to be seeing a little bit more of him later. Does this subject really think that he has spoiled the image by putting a coat on his face and hiding his face? Well, I'd say that the image is much more exciting because it holds a narrative promise because of what it conceals. And I'm using the word promise. Promise is an important word, and I think somebody yesterday was talking about this idea of the photograph and what it promises. Because there's a question about what it might deliver. Do we think that when we look at these images from the perp walk, which have been staged, that they're actually adding to the story of the subject? Why are we looking at the image? What do we want from the image? Well, we certainly want something because we're intrigued by the image, because the subject of the image is somebody who has potentially transgressed if they definitely haven't. So we're kind of intrigued by that image in the first place. The perp walk construct here caters to our desire for something that we just don't have access to. And it's perhaps more exciting because of what it doesn't reveal. It holds intrigue. The hanky clutched in his fist suggests so much. Perhaps the photograph here should be read not through the limits of what it represents, but everything it doesn't represent. It is everything it is not. Let's have a bit of water. Okay, but I'm not interested in that image. I'm interested in this image, and this is the image that really got me thinking about this idea of the perpetrator walking into court. I hate the perp walk. Actually, I don't want to say that anymore. This is Vicky Pryce. Do we all know who Vicky Pryce is? But not all of us will know who Vicky Pryce is, but it doesn't necessarily matter who Vicky Pryce is, but I'll tell you anyway. Vicky Pryce is a powerful industrial economist, but she's also, in the context of this image, the ex-wife of former cabinet minister Chris Huhne, the one that we were talking about earlier. And she's the woman who leaked the story of the speeding ticket to the press and then actually ended up getting caught out herself and going to prison herself. Now, she ostensibly seemed to have done this for revenge after an acrimonious marriage split, and she ended up in court where she pleaded marital coercion and went to prison anyway because her marital coercion plea didn't work out for her. And I started thinking about this idea of her image and what it means when I read an article by Zoe Williams in The Guardian. Zoe Williams observed that she's obviously determined not to meet any photographer's eye, but it's hard to look carefree when you're staring fixedly at the camera. Her face is set to unreadable, her mouth in that emotional no man's land between smile and repose. Now, the key word for me here is the word unreadable. Because in press and photojournalism, by its definition, it's there to be read, or it says it's there to be read, or we understand that it's there to be read. So how is it that an unreadable face finds itself splashed across every, or nearly every British front page, which it did on that day when this image came out? Perhaps the most powerful aspect of this photograph is precisely what can't be read, or in another word, the less it reveals, the more it has to say. she hasn't covered her face this time, but she has covered her expression, or she's tried to, and hence the fascination with the fixed gaze. I hope I'm on the right. So the story's ostensibly about the speeding ticket, but we also know that really it's about a woman's fall from power, politics, revenge, and family disintegration. Her fixed stare seems to give away a game of damage limitations on her part. She's aware of the inevitable narratives to be extrapolated from her photograph, and she's attempting to manage her own narrative. And she does her best, to give away as little as possible about her character or her psychology. But I think I'd say probably that she's misunderstood. She's misunderstood what we all know and what she knows really, which is that's the way that images are being read in this context. With her, the sort of blank expression or apparent blank expression, this image is an open one. Therefore, it holds huge narrative potential. It holds promise. Therefore, it's a successful image in news terms, in terms of the currency of news. And therefore, I'd say her strategy has backfired. The true grammar of the photograph is perhaps found in the gap between what we would expect to see, but which is not revealed. Her blank expression points to further aberration that is beyond her apparent crime. Why isn't she crying? In this way, her image jars with her story and yields speculation about another story of a savvy, successful woman trying to play the press and suffering a humiliation of failure. The question here holds so much promise of so many some things that might have happened or might be about to happen. And therefore, the image becomes a portal to speculation, and its possibilities are endless. Okay. What face did we expect to see when this man first appeared in our newspapers? Are we expecting to see the face of an ogre to support an ogre story? I would say no, I don't think we are expecting to see that. And if we had been expecting to see that, what would that image have looked like? The power of this image is in its mismatch. We have here a sorry figure against a backdrop of violence at its most violent. And for me, this image holds such a terrible violence because of the violence that it doesn't reveal. The image is subtracted in this way out of its context, and that makes it all the more uncomfortable and unsettling. And in a way, I suppose that's what makes our kind of reading or attempt to read this image more kind of mawkish, more kind of almost guilt-ridden in a way. You know, you look at these images, or I do anyway, with a kind of a real sense of discomfort and guilt, which is interesting. And I think that's because we're not looking at the image of a violent act, but we're looking at the image as a violent act. Remember that this photograph is a cut, it's an edit, it's taken from its context. And in this way, it's a fraction or a splinter, and the finer that splinter, the deeper it embeds. The violence is found in the gap between reality, our expectation, and the real, the unexplainable, the unknowable, the unthinkable. And in news terms, the currency of this image is that it does not represent all the horror and all the suffering that the subject has caused. The subtracted image is also an open image. It's open to anything that will stick. The image becomes politicised in this way. Deleuze describes a habitually guided movement only in relation to and reaction to our interests and needs. He's talking about cinema in this context. He says the image subtracts from the thing which does not interest it, but then the thing itself must be presented in itself as complete. And for me, in terms of talking about the perpetrator and what that quote might mean for them, the situation is just getting worse and worse for them, because there's a constructed narrative about what's not in the image, what is removed from the image. But then that constructed narrative can be anything. It can be politicised in any direction that it wishes to go or ends up going. But it somehow embeds itself for the reader as the truth. This image is all the more compelling because it doesn't offer us a historical timeline. It doesn't lead us through evidence and speculation. It gives us a constructed truth out of an aggressive shard. It belongs to the man with the coat on his head. Another very, very popular, it's not popular, but a very common image that a lot of us saw a few months ago. This is the man who we saw earlier with a coat on his head, and he is the Paralympic athlete Oscar Pistorius, and he stands accused of premeditated murder. Now, the reason why this has got to be in my presentation, this image, is because it's an image which drew on an aesthetic which really had little, I think, to do with the event and everything to do with its spectacle. And in this way, it was a photojournalist's gift. The photographer of this image, who's called Sifiwe Sibeko, who's an excellent photographer and has sort of had quite a lot of attention because of these images, actually complained bitterly about the challenging lighting conditions in the courtroom when he was trying to take these photographs that he took. The hands are one of the other ones. But obviously commentators applauded the photographs because they held the gravitas of a Caravaggio. Text journalists bore witness to, not to the event, but the photograph. And so he stands in the shadows, they said, his eyes dark pools of horror. On that note. Those dark shadows offered endless possibilities for a highly charged and very politicised speculation. The dingy, murky corners held a promise of ever-changing, constantly changing every moment, and it was a really big Twitter story, this one was as well, but ever-changing and unfolding stories of social disconnection, and sexual violence, and a metaphor for a nation in the grip of post-apartheid freefall. The image was open to whatever the reader or author needed it to be or wanted it to be. And in this context, this particular image, I would say, has started to close down as an image, which is why I wanted to show you this image in this context. Because we delivered here an emotional public gallery, and a new psychology is revealed which establishes a tableau. We have in this public gallery people on the right being outraged and shocked and horrified, and people on the left being perhaps distraught. And we'd expect that. We'd expect that with the kind of situation that we're in. It sort of lends itself to reality, but makes itself look even more theatrical. So the more real, the more theatrical. But back to this idea of the Caravaggio. So I started thinking about the Pistorius image, and I started thinking about the gravitas of the Caravaggio, and I could only think of this image. And I remember this image because it's on the front of Caravaggio books, and it often comes up when you look up Caravaggio on Google. But I couldn't remember the painting that it belonged to. How many does everybody remember the painting that it belongs to? Yes. So I couldn't remember it. But again, it's a story of horror and death and destruction. Okay, so Sibeko's image worked as a negation. It was that darkness and that fixed and frozen stare which reminded me of the picture of Judith. what face would we expect to see with Judith? It looks to me as if Caravaggio kind of was playing a similar game to the photojournalist today, except that Judith, he didn't edit images in that way in the 15th century. The power of her image is that it jars with her act. I could only remember her innocent and perplexed face against a pitch-black context, but here she is subtracted and reframed into an image very different. So I had to remind myself, Judith, seductress, murderer, saviour, saved her city by seducing and getting drunk and beheading an invading general, which is an Old Testament story. That's a really bad kind of interpretation of the story, but we haven't got time. But I would say, which of these images holds most currency today? Caravaggio, in the darkness and stillness, represents an aesthetic of the utterly macabre. And this has influenced photographers and editors today of today's cautionary tales. So this is an introduction. A 16-year-old Cyntoia Brown in America. She murdered a man who'd taken her to his house for sex. She was sort of in thrall of a pimp who was selling her for sex. And she's now serving life in prison. And we're perhaps intrigued by the perpetrator, whose image appears to be most contradictory of what it represents. The innocent and the beautiful and the youthful against a tale of sexual violence, excess and murder. This image of Cyntoia Brown is so subtracted, it's a tiny, tiny fragment from the courtroom. It becomes a beautiful and distilled poetry, a latter-day Judith perhaps, if ever there was one. But there's also an inherent violence in the image so subtracted from its context that the real becomes utterly unreal, and yet it opens up a dialogue which keeps us wanting more. Okay, our final perpetrator, another one that we've seen an awful lot of images of. Amanda Knox, convicted in 2007 of sexual assault and murder of her flatmate Meredith Kircher in Perugia in Italy. Amanda Knox was freed on appeal last year, but prosecutors are now seeking a retrial. Amanda Knox kept us intrigued with her apparent ease with which she faced her accusers. Here her photograph jars with everything that it should represent. With that beautiful blank and open expression, we enjoyed speculations about the very depths of her guilt at that time. But then she started to cry. And with her tears, her story appeared to end. As the tears flow, the narrative starts to close down. And here we have a represented truth which conforms to societal expectations. We lose the endless narrative possibilities of the unreadable and the unknowable. There's perhaps a beauty and pathos in the unreadable and the aberrant, those blank stares which give away so little and yet appeal to our passion an urge to reach out for more. It's a craving, perhaps, that we as readers know will not be satisfied. We enjoy, through these images, an endless desire for desire alone. We're perhaps sophisticated enough as readers of these images to know that we're not going to have any answers out of them. So I want to conclude by leaving the courtroom construct but staying with the accused and condemned. In the 21st century, does the real exist in a place represented in all its horror? Or is it found in a visual narrative that can't be read but can be interpreted depending on social and political fantasies of the time? I'll go back to this image again. In 1968, this Eddie Adams image was taken, and it perhaps woke us up to the nature of American support for military regimes in Vietnam. We perhaps were shocked out of a complacency and about an American intervention that we should have been quite happy with, perhaps. But what of its currency today? Well, I typed 1968 execution of the Viet Cong prisoner into Google, And this was the first image that came up. And the second one offered the same image, but represented as Lego wallpaper. That's it. Thank you.